All right, this is going to be a short video to get us caught up in the lectures. I'm just a little bit behind. I'm going to be talking about differences in emotional responding in this video. So Davidson in the late 90s came up with the 3 R's of emotional responding: reactivity, regulation, and recovery. And these basically describe the ways that emotional responding can vary, and they provide this timeline of emotional responding. The technical term for this is affective chronometry, but I actually rarely see that used even in the scientific literature. So the 3 R's is actually what I see a lot more. But basically, it's referring to differences in the peak response, the amount of time it takes to reach the peak, and the amount of time that it takes to recover. So if you look at these 3 lines, imagine these are 3 different individual animals. The blue line has the highest peak, but the green line, even though the peak is lower, it takes the animal longer to recover. And then the red line is lower peak and faster recovery time. And then the slopes of these lines are different as well. You see for the blue line that it's sort of a straighter, steeper slope, and then the green and the red take a little bit longer to reach the peak, or the red actually doesn't take longer because the peak is so low. But anyway, you get the idea is that there's these variations in these dimensions of how different animals respond to their environment. So let's look at reactivity specifically. This is often equated with behavioral or physiological arousal, emotional reactivity. There are different definitions of it, but this one is my favorite. It refers to latency, intensity, and threshold of response. Latency is just sort of how rapidly does the emotion increase, and then intensity is how high is the peak. And then the threshold of response is sort of how easily is that emotion triggered. And so when we talk about big feelings, dogs or other animals, we're typically talking about animals who very quickly go from 0 to 60, have a high peak, and are easily triggered. And that leads to these very, high arousal individuals. And what we know from other research is that there are individual differences in how animals respond to novelty and perceived threat, and that these differences show up very early in the lifetime. So a lot of this research has been done on humans, and we know that what's going on early also predicts later behavior. So 4-month-old infants, for example, were found to have different responses to novelty as measured by the sort of emotional response that they were having, as well as their motor response, so behavior, and their brain activity. And this is 4 months old. So very early on, these differences are showing up. And I just want to dig into this a little bit more. So these are now showing the predictions. So these infants that had higher levels of emotional responding at 4 months had differences later on. So at 9 months, they showed a stronger brain response to novel stimuli. They also were slower to approach unfamiliar objects and people when they were 1 to 2 years old, and they were more likely to avoid scary things when they were 1 to 2 years old. Also, toddlers that had higher avoidance showed higher avoidance at 5 years of age. So if they were, I don't know exactly how they define toddlers, but somewhere between probably 1 and 2, if they had high avoidance at 1 and 2 years of age. They were also more likely to have higher avoidance at 5 years of age. They also displayed hypervigilance and this attentional bias toward threat, which means that there's this tendency to interpret stimuli as if they are threatening. We also know that infants and toddlers that have this negative reactivity and poor behavioral inhibition are also more likely to have issues as teenagers, so higher levels of social withdrawal and anxiety. And fortunately, as is often the case, there hasn't been as much research on this done in dogs or other companion animals, but I do believe that it will be coming, hopefully relatively soon. Based on research that's been done on other aspects of behavior, however, it's highly likely that this remains true for other animals. So remember, the second R is regulation, and that regulation can be automatic or controlled. So when we're talking about automatic, that means things like attentional biases. So when you are operating in your environment, there are many, many things in the environment that you are not paying attention to. The same thing is happening with dogs. We cannot possibly attend to every single stimulus in the environment. We cannot possibly react to all of those. And so our brain makes decisions, often subconsciously, about what we are going to pay attention to. So that's one aspect of that automatic processing. And then there's also controlled regulation, and that's things like impulse control, choosing to focus attention, or withdrawing from a particular stimulus. And then in addition to these different types of regulation, you also see individual differences. So just like with the reactivity portion of things, we see individual differences in the regulation of that reactivity or of that emotional response. And this is often related to executive function, which we will talk about soon, as well as stress and trauma history, and is influenced by genetics as well. So why do we care about all of this? Well, differences in reactivity and regulation often influence things like withdrawal from perceived threat, as well as approach to potential reward, emotion and mood, and of course, ultimately behavior. So all of these things are likely to have a really strong impact on the behavior of the animals that we are working with. The third R is recovery. And if we look at recovery from negative affect, slower recovery from negative experiences is associated with higher levels of neuroticism, which is basically anxiety. And faster recovery, on the other hand, is associated with increased self-control. So those animals that take longer to recover from these stimuli are also likely to struggle more with behavior issues and with their environment than animals that have a faster recovery. We also know that if you're just looking at positive affect, that short duration of positive affect is associated with depression and increased marital stress in people. These are just a couple examples. And then there's also some relationship between the duration of positive affect and other aspects of well-being in life, but we really don't have a lot of knowledge about this. So for example, is it that individuals aren't having a lot of positive affect because they're under so much stress? Or is there something about sort of innate within the individual that's limiting the length of the positive affect, and that's leading to decreased well-being? I mean, we just don't know. The other thing that we don't know is if recovery from negative and positive emotions is associated. So for example, if you recover faster from negative emotions, does that also mean that positive emotions are sustained for longer, or are those occurring on two separate tracks, basically. So we don't really know the answer to this question, but certainly when it comes to negative affect, extended periods of negative affect, strong responses to negative affect, and easily triggered negative affect are all associated with decreased well-being. So that's it. Thanks, guys.